Welcome to the GXM podcast, where we explore news and topics around video game music and the intersection between the games and music industries. My name's Tom Quillfeldt. I work for game soundtrack label Laced Records and also podcast with the Cane and Rinse crew. My usual co-host, Mat Ombler, is otherwise indisposed today, but we will hopefully get back to our normal fortnightly service once all the kind of summer holiday and wedding stuff is all out the way and in the past. For my part, I have been to a talk with Inon Zur, a masterclass talk at BAFTA in London recently, which was very fun. Inon's a great kind of raconteur and talker and has lots of brilliant advice for people. He was saying about the music he makes and the music he listens to. He wants the composer to tell him something he already knew. It could be harmony, instrumentation, something like that. But also to tell him something he doesn't know, to subvert something, to invert something, to come up with something from left field that he wasn't expecting. And he also talked a lot about pitching, which was very interesting, about how, a lot of his time is spent on failed pitches. Because you've got to work, you've got to hustle, you've got to pitch for different games and put together briefs, and you'll lose out to various people. He was talking about losing out to Richard Jakes, the Guardians of the Galaxy score, which Inon swore blind he would get after his brief, but it was very funny because Richard was in the audience, and that was all a good laugh. So yeah, very, very interesting. I don't know if that's going to go up on YouTube. It possibly will via the BAFTA channel. I'll link people up if I see that around. Couple of other things. I saw about the Indie Symphony concert that was held by Orchestra Victoria in Melbourne. I think that was on the 8th of September 2023, so after this publishes. That included the music of things like Hollow Knight, Celeste, Necrobarista, Journey, Hades, and Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, also Stray Gods. I don't know if that's going to be streamed later on. Hopefully it is, so people can check it out, but otherwise I think it was a ticketed concert. There's also a Cult of the Lamb concert happening in Melbourne during International Games Week there. And I believe that's happening. A couple of performances for that Cult of the Lamb gig is the 6th of October and 2 on the 7th of October. So if you happen to be out in Melbourne and at International Games Week, maybe check that out. Something else funny I saw, Laced Records, we put out a lot of the RuneScape digital albums and a couple on vinyl. And I just saw something for the Edinburgh Fringe, which was, there's a musical called Runesicle, based on the game RuneScape, and that's coming to YouTube on the 29th of September 2023. And apparently the audience gets to decide what happens next. So that it sounds like they say in the marketing they've got some absolute bangers, and it's a new interactive adventure. So definitely keep an eye out for that. I'll put a link in the show notes for that. I've been listening to all sorts of stuff recently. I've been listening to Baldur's Gate 3 soundtrack, which came to streaming platforms, and reading Pierre's Now Playing newsletter, which continues to throw up new gems that I hadn't been aware of previously. That's a really good way to just start a whole bunch of playlists and never actually get around to kind of properly getting through absolutely everything you'd ever want to listen to. It sort of never ends, the amount of soundtracks and non-gaming music that clogs up my want to listen to playlists. Distant Worlds 6 is out in the wild. That's the 6th album from Arnie Roth that covers Final Fantasy music. They're sort of more straight orchestral covers than something like Final Symphony, which is a rearrangement of various themes put together in suites and things like that. But Distant Worlds 6 is sort of more recognisably the pieces themselves intact, but performed by an orchestra. I've still been jamming on the Citizen Sleeper soundtrack, which is just so beautiful and sad and melancholy. absolutely nails the vibe it's going for. That's an artist called Toy Tree, Amos Roddy. I think it's under his Amos Roddy name. Laced did the Strafe soundtrack a long while ago, a few years ago now, with Amos, and he's just such a talented composer. I do have an interview for you with Colin Yost, Director of Gaming Partnerships at Sony Music. He mainly works with the label Sony Masterworks and also Milan Records, which Sony acquired a few years ago now. I wanted to talk to Colin about this very peculiar A&R role that is possible to have at video game soundtrack labels. For Laced Records, I do a bit of A&R work with them, or at least, well, you could call it that. It's a bit of research. It's just sort of helping out with track lists and working out what, might be coming our way in terms of signings and things like that. I'm not the head of the label, and I don't do a lot of the very difficult stuff to do with vinyl and warehouses and production and all of that actually difficult stuff to do with, finances and stock taking and shipping and all of those headaches that I sidestep happily. But some of the work I do could be considered to some extent A&R, but Colin definitely performs that role for Sony Music in terms of spotting game projects and game soundtracks and things like that. And he and I had a very nice chat. We've actually had 2 chats now, and I just thought it was really funny, the things that an A&R at a soundtrack label has to take into account that a traditional A&R person who's signing, pop artists, indie rock bands, even classical jazz artists, it's just a completely different ball game. So I really hope you enjoy my chat with Colin. Colin, welcome to GXM. Thank you very much for speaking to me today. Can you just tell the audience a bit about your role as Director of Gaming Partnerships at Sony Music? And maybe start a little further back, like how you come to be in LA, how you come to have this sort of prestigious job title.
Prestigious. Thank you for that. It's so funny with the job titles. I don't feel like I've ever actually had a job title that's maybe truly been fitting. This one's probably the closest, I think. I picked this one out myself. So, in previous titles, it's been A&R and a mixture of other things. And I'm sure we'll get into it later, but as you and I both know, we're not really typical A&R. So that was always confusing. But yeah, so I've been with Sony, specifically the label Masterworks, and now in the last few years, Milan Records, since 2015. So it's been 8 years. And this was back in New York when I first started out with them. So I lived in New York for most of my life. I grew up in upstate New York and then moved to New York City just like senior year of college is actually when I moved into Brooklyn, and then stayed there for 7 years. So that's when I first started working with Sony. And back then, I just kind of started out as a temp. And funny enough, gaming really wasn't kind of a part of my life at that point. It was just post-college. When I was in college, I kind of decided to step away from gaming and really focus on studies and actually trying to do what I wanted with my life. And it kind of stayed that way, post-graduating. And so when I first started at Sony, I was just a temp supporting some like PR, sales, marketing, just doing kind of basic entry-level stuff. And I kind of stayed in that position of just kind of entry-level, coordinator level duties until I think it was around 2018. It was a few years in, basically. It was Final Fantasy 15 had come out around that time, and through our partnership with like SMEJ, it was Sony Music Japan, this opportunity to release a CD in the US had kind of fallen on our laps, and there was like an email that went out that just said, "Does anybody know what this is? Like, should we take on this random CD project of something no one's ever heard of?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, that's a popular game. The CD market at that point was, still kind of dying, but I was like, it's probably worth it. I mean, if we don't really have to do anything except just import it and distribute it, whatever. And then that kind of did pretty well for us. We actually sold a decent amount of units, and I think that's kind of when the light bulb went off in my head, like, oh, I wonder if there's more opportunities like this. And then it kind of faded, though. I just kind of I put it in the back of my head, and it was not that long after that another opportunity kind of fell on our laps, which was God of War in 2018. That same kind of question came to us. I don't know why exactly it came to Masterworks back then, but it did. They were just like, hey, yeah, we need a soundtrack release partner. Are you guys interested? Again, nobody knew what it was except for me. So I was like, oh, yeah, I mean, that's going to be huge. We should absolutely do something with that. And then that one, it became the hit that it was and still is. And that's really when the light bulb went off, and I was like, okay, we're as a label, we're kind of stepping in this direction of doing more soundtracks and stepping away from kind of frontline artist releases. And I should have clarified too. Masterworks as a label had always been focused on classical repertoire, jazz repertoire, kind of the crossover repertoire of the two. Just kind of a random assortment for a long time. And so it was around this point that the label really decided to step more into the soundtrack lane. And in 2019 is when they acquired Milan Records, which was an established soundtrack label. And so, yeah, that light bulb went off after God of War, and I really just started speaking up and saying, hey, I think there's this opportunity with this game and that game, and no one's really kind of paying attention to this area of video game soundtracks. I think at that time it was probably just Laced Records, to be honest. I mean, maybe there were some other tiny indies, right?
What sort of 2018 period? Well, I think there's a history going back further than even I've touched upon in terms of. I mean, there are some very old video game soundtrack labels. There was Nile Rodgers' Something Else.
Oh yeah.
And then I'm sure there were other things even further back that there's a couple of people I'd love to get on the podcast to kind of speak to them about the history of, official releases, and then there's the whole cover scene and arrangement releases. But I Am 8-Bit were around in 2018 and further back, and I remember, I think Mondo were doing vinyl releases of video game stuff specifically back then.
Mondo definitely was, yeah.
Yeah. I can't remember exactly when Lakeshore came about, but I wouldn't say we were. When Danny started Laced in 2016, obviously that angle for him was Hotline Miami Kickstarter with vinyl. And I think it was the novelty of vinyl back then. Mm-hmm. Not to say he was the first by any stretch, but just that an indie game on vinyl, it was quite a hot property at the time, the Hotline Miami soundtrack in and of itself outside of the game. So I think he just sort of bottled lightning, and that that gave Laced the kick up the bum to come into existence. But so after God of War, and obviously God of War has become, since 2018, the reboot has become this enormous Sony property. It was always a kind of frontline-ish PlayStation title, but had kind of, after God of War Ascension, maybe the sort of energy behind it had waned a little bit. But, now it's, way up there with Last of Us, Horizon, it's absolutely frontline PlayStation property. What did you do next? Or what did you and the team in Milan choose to do after God of War? What was the sort of next project that maybe saw you sailing in a particular direction?
It was pretty slow at first. It was, I mean, once God of War became a success, and I think everyone kind of was like, oh, Colin kind of knows this video game thing that no one else knows. I just, on my own. And by the way, I was still kind of like this, I might have been like a manager at this point or something, but, I really was in this kind of more support role for a few different departments. And so I just kind of took it upon myself to kind of seek out these one-off opportunities with soundtracks of things that I knew were coming up, that maybe others weren't really, when I say others, I mean, other major record labels really weren't paying attention to. I think the next one we did after God of War was Kingdom Hearts 3, we had the so Hikaru Utada is a Sony Japan artist. She did the song, as she always does, for the game, along with Skrillex, and that one became available. I forget how we found out about it. I think maybe just poking around about the music for Kingdom Hearts 3, and then them saying, oh, hey, well, yeah, the song is with Sony because it's Hikaru Utada. And then so just through internal measures, we worked out, we handled the US release and they handled the international release, and that was kind of our next big one. And that was a huge, I mean, I would say equally, if not maybe a little bit bigger than the God of War in terms of success. Commercially, I mean, when you attach Skrillex and Utada together, that's kind of a smash hit, and it was. And then I think that's kind of when everybody else at Masterworks really turned their heads and was just like, okay, like what is going on in gaming? Like 2 back-to-back hits. These are doing pretty well for us. Is there more of this out there? And then even still, it kind of became like, keep looking for these. You know, we're not saying this is your new full-time job, you know, the kind of A&R approach, but keep doing this. And then fast forward a couple years later, I just decided that more stuff had kind of come along our way. We were doing more PlayStation titles. We had started doing some indie titles. I'm trying to think who the next big... I think Bandai Namco might have been the next partner we started working with. Slowly but surely, we were kind of like finding these newer publishers that were interested in doing these one-offs with us and seeing how it would go. And that's when I finally was just like, okay, well, I'm in New York at the pre-COVID at the time. You know, all these gaming conventions are happening in the US, over on the West Coast. PlayStation and other publishers are also based here on the West Coast. So I just kind of made the call to move out here myself and try to pursue what I was doing with gaming. And then that was towards the end of 2019 and not long before COVID. And then, since then it's kind of been a full-time gig of really seeking out soundtrack opportunities with gaming. And since then, now, in this new role of mine, the reason why it's, partnerships focus is because we're as Sony, we're trying to see what else we could potentially do with these gaming publishers. That's not just soundtrack recordings.
Well, one of the most interesting aspects of your position, so Sony is a giant company, and entertainment-wise, there's obviously the consumer electronics, which is the Walkman, the original, the TVs, the phones, everything else. But there's, of course, Sony PlayStation, massive division, possibly the biggest division in the company now. There's Sony Music, which is one of the 3, major labels in the world. There's Sony Pictures, which is one of the big film producers. So can you talk just a little bit about what the opportunities and the challenges of being part of this huge machine?
The challenge being with not just Sony, but any major corporation as big as Sony is, nothing's really done just kind of on your own or of your own decision. You do have to get certain approvals or, work it out amongst certain key people. And that's, it's a small disadvantage. Those processes are there to kind of, make sure it all works out and we make the best decisions. But it does make things go a bit slower. And I think that's probably more on the physical distribution side of things, more so than, if we're talking about digital or just overall trying to get a new deal. Because with physical, there's just it's an old business that's kind of trying to become new again, and it's expensive. So I think those decisions come with a lot of red tape. From what I just said, like kind of starting around 2018 timing, I do feel like it was kind of late to the game. I mean, like you said, like something else had kind of already been doing this, Laced, Lakeshore. I mean, there was other key players that I would say certain game publishers already knew about just because they were the first to kind of knock on their door. And these game publishers aren't thinking about vinyl or really too much about their digital releases of their soundtracks. So when anybody comes knocking and says, hey, we're really interested in this opportunity to do this with you guys, I think that just sticks around like, oh, this little company I've never heard of is reaching out, and we're going to remember them as long as they do a good job. So I feel like when I kind of came around and started doing this, it was a little bit late in the game, and I think there's a slight disadvantage in that. I don't really know if that's being a part of Sony too much, but I think it kind of comes to the fact, well, there's Lace Records, for example, does a really great job. We're kind of happy with them and the deal terms and blah, blah, blah. And when it comes to Sony, it's like, well, you guys have certain overhead, certain things that I think come into the deal structure that maybe we're not used to. And so I think it's a mixture of trying to kind of prove ourselves and say, hey, yeah, you already know Sony, like it's a well-known brand. You probably didn't know we do this other side of the business with soundtracks, gaming specifically, and I think kind of just trying to convince, new partners to give us a chance. Right, I think is again a small challenge. These are all kind of small. I would say these are small and normal challenges in any competitive business.
Yeah.
So it's not like I don't think these are unique to Sony by any means. And there's honestly a lot of advantages, right? I mean, to be honest, I think about it pretty often. If I went back to 2018 and kind of started my own thing, right, like Danny did with Waste, would I have had the same success rate as I did, being at Sony and having a Sony email address and reaching out and saying, hey, I'm Colin from Sony. We're interested in doing something with you. And then, I think to some publishers, it obviously gets their attention. Like, oh, what's Sony doing reaching out? I do think there's some weight carried in the name and having that advantage. Yeah. And it's safe, it's kind of a safe route. And so that's always kind of been an advantage when pursuing new partners. And I think having the advantage of also being a part of a major record label. We don't do the same frontline releases as our sister labels, Beyonce, Harry Styles, all these others. But we're still a Sony major label, and having the resources of a Sony major label has been super beneficial as well, because that's that at the end of the day, you can take those risks. It's not really a worry if you want to try something new or get creative. And I think that's actually probably the biggest advantage to being a part of Sony is, and not even just Sony, I should say. I would say Sony Masterworks specifically. They've always been very understanding and open to ideas and getting creative, and having that support system along with, the freedom a little bit with the budgets and everything has been a big advantage for us, I think.
Awesome. So what we were having fun talking about in private was just what a strange job being a video game soundtrack label A&R person is. Because you can probably speak more to what a traditional A&R person does. But when I was coming up in the music industry sort of 10 years ago, 15 years ago, not that I did this job, but the A&R people I did sort of flash across my awareness. I managed an artist once, and we did have a couple of A&R meetings at places like XL Records and Atlantic and stuff like that. So that was a fun, brief window into that world. And now I find myself, some of the time it's like looking up old Mega Man spreadsheets, which is the exact opposite of going to a gig and pressing the flesh, is like poring over, tracklist spreadsheets or going over like VGMDB, old listings for old Japanese video games and getting lost in the weeds in research and finding which track was on this release but wasn't on this release, and then there was the special edition. And could you just talk a little bit about some of the weirder aspects of your current job which sort of really separate it from your life as a, I don't know if you were that type of A&R, that kind of got to be out everywhere, be seen kind of A&R. But what's some of the kind of weirder shifts that you've had to make getting into the soundtrack world?
It's almost like we talk about it as kind of like ex-music industry a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it really feels that way. Like I don't know. I don't walk into the office and kind of feel like everybody else a little bit sometimes. I mean, I never had a traditional A&R role. My old boss was the head of A&R for Masterworks, and so I did glimpse into that world pretty frequently. And honestly, when I was younger, when I 2015, I first started working at Sony, and even before then, that was always the dream in my mind. Like I graduated college and thought like, oh yeah, I'm going to go be some big shot in the music industry. A&R or a manager. Yeah, I mean, I think that's everybody's. If you want to go work in music, I don't know what sounds sexier than like I'm A&R for this artist or I'm manager of this artist. Like that's I think everybody's. And honestly, whenever I've spoken to interns or people just looking to get into the industry for the first time, that's kind of always the dream is wanting to do that, right? And how do I get into that? Who do I talk to? What do I study? What do I do?
Because I suppose the glamour of it, isn't it, is that it's the life of the schmoozer. It's the life of the schmoozer on the company credit card.
Yes.
Going to gigs and going to see artists and going to nice restaurants and et cetera, all of that kind of glamour. Supposed glamour.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. That was what I was trying to pursue for the longest time. I would say for most of my life. I mean, when I decided I was going to work in music, and I can't really think of like a clear moment where it was just like, oh yeah, I'm gonna pursue this other thing. At the time, it just kind of felt like, oh, this is, I still have kind of like my regular music industry job at Masterworks, and then there's like this thing I'm also trying to pursue, which is for the company, but it always kind of felt separate, even from the get-go. Even when I knew the label was switching over more to a soundtrack label, it just kind of felt like I was almost stepping away from traditional music industry and entering more this other side of the industry that. I mean, and maybe this is just soundtracks in general. I think if you're a part of a soundtrack label, you are kind of more like a satellite operation of what's kind of happening in the traditional music industry a little bit. I mean, you're dealing with IP owners, you're dealing with film, TV, video games, anime, whatever it is. You're really not dealing with artists, which I think is its own ball of wax that I'm honestly kind of thankful not to be dealing with a lot of times. And so, I mean, I'm happy to be doing, I guess we'll just call it A&R for the soundtrack side of things. It's a lot different than traditional A&R, and I think in better ways, like I just highlighted, right? I mean, not having to deal with artists can be.
What are you saying? Are you possibly implicating that artists might be just a touch neurotic, or you may have to shepherd them and babysit them, dare I say, sometimes? Of course, that's not the relationship of every artist in their A&R, but enough stories come out, again, especially about the major label artists, about keeping them happy and keeping the show on the road, as it were, and that with their management team and all of that encompasses it is a tricky kind of rarefied skill set, I would say. Yeah,
it takes I think a certain type of person, and we don't, because sometimes we are dealing with just composers, right? I mean, sometimes music rights are with the composers, or sometimes the composers are just very involved with the music release. And it's awesome. It's like they're just happy and grateful to be working with any label who's going to take care of their music. And because for them it's also like, oh well, I was already paid for the gig, I did the gig, the music is there. This is more like a cherry on top. Oh, I get to talk with you guys about it. It's a different feeling for them. It's a different feeling for us. Kind of going back to even before soundtracks, right? Like those first few years working at Sony, it was very much like what you were talking about. I mean, I also tried to manage some artists on the side when I was younger and thought I wanted to go down that path. Learned real quickly I didn't want to go down that path.
That is it's a hard. Being an artist manager of an artist who's still up and coming, that is absolutely brutal, because you're second guessing yourself every second. And also, I mean, just the time that we would have both been trying to manage young artists or nascent artists was a time of huge flux in the music industry, switching to streaming, and just it being quite a difficult time. And then I wouldn't want to be an artist manager now from the UK with Brexit and live touring being so complicated and expensive suddenly post-COVID. So yeah, it's a tough road. It's a tough road for artists in general as well. And like you say, composers are just keen to be collaborative, and because I think something I heard Enon Zur was talking about at a talk at BAFTA last night was just game composers have to be collaborative. Yeah, because by its very nature, the projects you work on, you're working with these developers, you're working with the audio team, the audio director, the creative team, and if you're not a team player, fact, you're just not going to get hired. So I think by the time it comes to the soundtrack project, which tends to come, once their work for the main game is finished, there's a general willingness to just collaborate and get the best quality, get the best version of the soundtrack, etc. So we're kind of blessed in that way. I would agree. I'd love you to talk a little bit about the aspect of trying to ascertain what are the good soundtracks, quality-wise and commercial kind of viability, but then also this added weirdness of trying to second-guess whether the game is, if it's a new game, going to do well. So that the A&R job ends up being about playing kind of 3D chess on a very complicated board, because you're trying to pick great composers or musicians and judge whether that particular soundtrack of theirs is really going to work. And then also you're sort of at the mercy of how the game's going to do and be received by the community. How have you found that side of things?
Well, that's the hardest part. that I guess is maybe more like the traditional A&R risk and reward. You're taking a chance, potentially. Most often, you're taking a chance on non-established IP. It's probably like a first ever game release. Even if it's coming from a major studio or a major publisher that's backing it, and even if it is a sequel release, there's always the risk of this thing flops. If it's met early on with so much hype from the trailer, from whatever people are talking about, even if it's a success, let's say, even if it's just like commercially it's good, it gets, IGN gives us it 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10. That's I would say a good release. It's still like, did it meet the hype, right? That's just one very nuanced aspect of this whole thing, which is if it doesn't meet the hype or honestly exceed expectations, that's oftentimes something you kind of have to keep in mind in terms of a success, because so many games get released today. You can say the same thing about music and film and TV, and there's so many releases of everything. But I think for any label, if you ask me, to kind of consider like, hey, is this really a worthwhile commercial venture for us? You have to contemplate the fact like, okay, is this really going to blow everyone away and leave a lasting impact? Because I think that's where, and we're not even just talking about, I think, video games at the moment. I think with whether it's film, TV, anime, you name it, the music is oftentimes in the background. It's always in the background for the most part.
Yeah.
And even if a big composer's name is attached to it, it doesn't matter. If the film, TV show, the video game, if it doesn't really leave a lasting impact or create these emotional moments, and people aren't spending hours on hours and hours with a video game, then it's hard to imagine that the soundtrack itself would stand on its own 2 feet, right? And I don't know if you feel different or kind of agree with this, but this is the kind of constant decisions and kind of a struggle, I think, in your head that you're making when you're kind of determining this. And it sounds, I hate talking about it like this, because it's like, if you ask me, I've listened to your earlier episodes, and it was an earlier one where you guys talked about the games that had great soundtracks but just weren't commercial successes as video games, right? And I think that's so often the case. Composers are great just across the board, and I think you can find so many composers and so many soundtracks that are just, they stood the test of time. No one heard about them. No one heard about the game. It's just kind of been forgotten to time, and I think that's more often than not the case. And that's just the reality of the business we're in, right? I probably 9 out of 10 are just going to be forgotten and kind of left out, and you got to find that one that's going to really stand out. And take your chances on it, and that's so the first part is narrowing it down. Okay, which ones do we think are going to kind of potentially stand the test of time and leave an impact? And that's like, okay, out of those, which do we think are really going to kind of deliver a commercial success enough to kind of get people to notice the soundtrack? And then that's where you kind of put your money, and you take a chance. And it's also the last part of the job is really like this constant struggle of, especially if you're a gamer and you're really a fan of all this stuff and you play these games, it's kind of like, well, I loved this, and this was an amazing game, and the soundtrack was great, but 90% of the other people in the world that play video games didn't notice it or didn't agree, and it's about, and and this is also the traditional kind of A&R feeling, right? It's like you take a chance on an artist too. This is the same feeling. You could really believe in an artist, and for whatever reason, they're just not sticking. They're not hitting the masses, and I think that's where our jobs really hit the most traditional A&R aspect. Is you're betting your money on the horse, and you really want it to win, but sometimes it's just a bad bet, and that's the hardest part. And it's very nuanced with film and TV and video game IP for that reason. Yeah. And there's just so many coming out, and you honestly also can't really rely on like traditional means to promote and get these out there. I mean, like if you're an artist, you can have a TikTok, you can have other social media feeds, you could go live on Twitch if you wanted to, if you're into that space. Like there's so many ways where you can get yourself out there and promote a personality, promote a certain look, talk about your music. I mean, there's so many ways to reduce the risk and take those chances. Well, the soundtrack, it's kind of just like, all right, well, fingers crossed that this IP does really well,
It's just about love. You just need to cross your fingers that gamers are going to love the world of the game. They're going to love being in that world while they play the game, and then it's going to create such lasting memories that they want to relive that experience later on by listening to the soundtrack and take them back into the world. It's super fascinating. I mean, at Laced, we had an interesting case with, I think, our second signing, Danny's second or third signing, which was No Man's Sky, which obviously had a great band, 65 Days of Static, behind the soundtrack, and they were bringing their own audience already to the soundtrack release. And we did for that one, we did digital, vinyl and CD. And the game just got massive hype back in leading up to August 2016. Huge hype. It had that Spike VGA Awards trailer, which had the 65 Days of Static song on it. And, just massive hype for that game. And then it dropped. And people may remember historically that there wasn't the most positive reception for it at the time. But because of the band and the quality of the soundtrack as well, and the marketing it had already received, to some extent the soundtrack had legs to kind of walk on its own in a way. And then gradually No Man's Sky, the developers patched it and grew it and expanded it and added all of these features, and it is now the great kind of revival story of the industry. I mean, in terms of you talking about playing games for a lot of hours, you guys released the digital soundtrack for Planet of Lana recently with Takeshi Furukawa. Wonderful orchestral score. Obviously, he did the Last Guardian previously. But it's a short game in the kind of mold of like Limbo and Inside. It's a kind of, you play it for 4 to 5 hours, you complete it, hopefully it's had an emotional impact on you, and a lot of shorter games do leave their mark and can have very successful soundtracks. But it's not a game that you spend 100 hours, living in, like an Elden Ring or, Skyrim or something like that. So what's your feeling with one like that? Surely with the case of Planet of Lana, it is a bit of a mixture of kind of, this game's, it's an arty game. It's got a certain amount of press. It's coming out on Game Pass. The composer's reasonably well known, and it's a wonderful soundtrack. But it's not a game that people spend hundreds of hours in. So it's case by case, isn't it? Like, how much do you think about how long a player's going to play a particular game? Yeah,
in the case of, I think there's a very clear strategy difference between an indie game and a AAA or a AA release. Indies are the harder. I mean, like, so oftentimes with indies, at least for me, for us, it's more of I love this composer. I love the work he's doing, or I love the messaging that the game is trying to do, the art style. I mean, oftentimes it's a passion project, and you hope like I would love for this game to see the light of day and people love it and talk about it and it becomes a thing that people actually remember. You hope, but at the end of the day, I mean, and this is not like this is not to badmouth indies by any means, but there's so many indie game releases, and I think it's it's really hard to compete. And we've talked about this too. Like, is your release window butting up against one of the biggest games of the year that's also coming out? You know, is it near a holiday? I mean, there's so many factors going against releasing an indie game that I probably think that more often than not, when you release an indie game, it probably doesn't find commercial success until months, potentially years later.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it just takes so long for people to discover, sift through the masses that are being released, and sometimes it's the weirdest thing. You know, Untitled Goose Game. It's like, who would have thought? Yeah, I mean, you know what I mean? Like, it's that's the world of indie games. It's just like, you never know. Sometimes it's the funniest thing, and then you also have games like Celeste it was a beautiful game and an amazing composer, and the music was incredible. You know what I mean? Like, sometimes it does just work out for the right title that you think like, oh yeah, that has to be good, and then sometimes it's just like it just falls on deaf ears, and you're like, well, I don't understand why. And that's the risk of indies. And so oftentimes, you know, you talked about Planet of Lana. We've also, I mean, like, recently we just released the soundtrack to Fae Farm, which the game comes out this Friday on the 8th. And, you know, that was another, like, the music was done by Chris Velasco, who has a lot of credits throughout his long career. Honestly, this score for him was, in my opinion, vastly different than what he's used to composing, and so it was just interesting to hear that. And the game, you know, the game's being backed by Nintendo, is getting a lot of support, and you know, there's a lot of things going for it. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't end up kind of being that commercial success that we all hope for, it doesn't. You know, it does matter. I mean, I have a job. I have things to deliver on. But at the end of the day, too, there is this feeling of like it's always worth to take that risk on a good composer, a good score, a good game, and at that point, it's kind of out of your hands, right? And that part stays true for also even a AAA game, because everybody has seen every AAA game with all the hype just come out. It's potentially unfinished. It's buggy. It doesn't hit the mark. I mean, you know what I mean? So that risk, I think, is apparent everywhere. But the funny thing with a AAA title, you know, you talk about Starfield, God of War, Spider-Man. I mean, any of these AAA games from anywhere, they seem to always find an audience with the soundtrack, because it's almost like a game of numbers. Like, if it sells 2 million copies out the gate, well, then, you know, at least 2 million people are going to be hearing the music.
A lot, yeah, for many hours, yeah.
Right. So you'll get something out of it. And potentially maybe 10% or 1% of those 2 million people will want to buy a vinyl. Like, it's more of a game of numbers at that point. Whereas with an indie game, you know, that indie game might be the same quality as that AAA game, but only 2,000 people play it instead of 2 million.
Yeah, and over the last few years, I mean, just for context, we're recording this a day before Starfield's on general release. Baldur's Gate 3 recently came out, and I'd say was this not surprise hit, but like sleeper hit in waiting this year. And that's a year with a new Final Fantasy, a new Zelda, etc., etc. So we're speaking in 2023, and it has been a mammoth year for AAA, especially.
Yes.
I would say that the trend for the last few years has been, both with indie soundtracks and indie games, that sort of each year has its small handful of breakout indies, aesthetically speaking. So it could be something like an Undertale, Stardew Valley, Celeste, Hollow Knight, that kind of thing. That, like you say, that is a game of numbers, and nothing can compete with the marketing spend of a Starfield or a Legend of Zelda, really, in terms of general awareness of every aspect of the game. But we should just touch on vinyl, really, because that is this when I tell my family at like family gatherings, it's like, oh yeah, I work for a record label. Okay. I work for a soundtrack record label. All right. I work for a video game soundtrack label. And they're like, I didn't know that existed. Oh yeah, and we specialize in vinyl. And they're like, huh? and they just, that string of words is almost meaningless to them. But the vinyl market's really kicking at the moment, in a way that it was only just sort of coming through back in 2016 when I got started. Can you just talk a little bit about what turns a property for you into a prospect for vinyl from your perspective? It may seem obvious that like a God of War 2018 and Ragnarok later, like absolute no-brainer, people just waiting for the announcement or whatever. But what are some of the considerations?
For those listening that probably aren't aware of this, and honestly, I think a lot of people aren't aware, because so often when we talk to, whether it's a new or an existing partner, and this isn't just video games, this is film, TV, I mean, you name it. Now, in today's world, if you're not having a conversation about vinyl, it's almost like, okay, well, we want to find someone who does want to talk to us about vinyl. It's like everybody wants to release something on vinyl. This is what I'm noticing, and I think that's just because it's a cool thing to have. It's a piece of merchandise, but no one really. I think no one outside of those who work at a label really understand all the nuances of releasing on vinyl, and it's not just a done deal. It's not like, oh yeah, they cost a penny to make and we can make 10,000 of them and it's great for everybody. Like, no, it's actually literally the opposite. They're expensive to produce, especially post-COVID world. A lot of pieces of vinyl, the elements that go into vinyl have gone up in cost, and I point that out because I even to the consumer, to the fans out there who would love to see some of their gaming, favorite gaming soundtracks on vinyl. I would also love to do it, but if it's like a 3LP or a 4LP release, I don't want to charge you $100 retail for that vinyl for a game that maybe wasn't commercially successful, but there's 1,000 dedicated fans out there. You know what I mean? I think that's one part of it where they are expensive to produce. And oftentimes soundtracks, and this is also where it's much more difficult than traditional A&R or even just traditional artist releases when it comes to vinyl. Harry Styles can put out a 12-track album, single LP, retail $40 to $50, which is absurd, but they can do it. And it's, hand over fist profit. It's a no-brainer. With any soundtrack, I mean, you're talking minimum probably like 90 minutes of music, roughly. So it's a 2LP. I mean, I can't think of any soundtrack in recent years that's been a single LP. So it's a double LP or more, always. And you want the packaging to look nice. You don't want it to be cheap. You're really delivering to fans that have a high standard for what they want. And you know this, right? I mean, like, we're in that Facebook group now for video game vinyl. I mean, like, even if it's a bootleg, it's got to look it's got to look nice. It's got to feel nice. It can't be crap. And so they want all these things and we want all these things, but at the end of the day, it really does come down to it's expensive to ship, it's expensive to distribute, it's expensive to manufacture, and that's just because procedure for making vinyl is still outdated. They're still modernizing it, but it's not an easy business to be in, and many people on the record label side don't like being back in the business of vinyl. It's just it's a headache. There's so many headaches that go into it, and I'm saying all this because I hope that whoever listens to it will appreciate the fact that, like, if we're doing a vinyl release, there's a lot of love and care going into it.
Yes,
and I would love to do a vinyl release for everything we do. I really would. I love collecting vinyl myself. I love listening to vinyl. I know a lot of people do. It's just sometimes, if at the end of the day we know it's going to sell less than 1,000 copies, or even if it does sell 1,000 copies, when you're Sony and you have certain overhead and just certain things, it unfortunately just can't make sense for us a lot of times. And that's just the truth of it. And that's the hard reality of vinyl. And maybe it'll change. I mean, I'm still waiting for someone to kind of come out of the woodwork and be like, hey, we've found a new way to make vinyl, and it costs 50% less or whatever, and all of a sudden it's like, because I do fear, and I don't know if you share this. I'd be curious to know. I do fear that we're teetering on the edge of that same moment with CDs in the late 90s, where you paid whatever it was, 20, at least here in the US, $20 or $30 for a single disc CD. Just right on the cusp of LimeWire and Napster and all these things hitting the internet. And then all of a sudden became nearly free, or it was free. I'm a little bit worried that vinyl's teetering on the edge of like, wow, it's $50 now for a single LP vinyl. This is a rich person's hobby. I got to get out of it. It's also, it takes up space in my apartment. Like, why am I spending all this money and taking up all this space? You know what I mean? I do feel like we're teetering that edge a little bit. And with, you know, the gaming audience, maybe it's a little bit different because there are a lot of super fans and true dedicated lovers out there that would buy a piece of merchandise. But I don't like how expensive vinyl is becoming, especially when you look at like pre-COVID. You could still retail a single LP for like $20 to $25. And now it seems like we're getting close to double that in some ways. But how do you feel?
The thing is, you go on Instagram Reels and you see people with the most enormous Warhammer collections, you know, little figurine collections or Lego collections. I think I know. It's definitely one of these things where the reason the market's done well, I believe, is because as video games have got more and more digital, people's love of them is the same. People still play them for hundreds of hours, but if they got it on Steam, if they got it in a Humble Bundle or a digital code, or they bought it digitally, they have nothing to hold on to. And that's where you get into merch for any particular game, T-shirts, posters, whatever. Yeah. And I think vinyl is just the sort of one of the more luxurious pieces of merch that isn't a $500 figurine or whatever, that represents the game. You've got these large pieces of artwork. It's just something to get hold of, and you get the quality music format and kind of memorialization of the game. It's another way for game designers sometimes to express, you know, the aesthetics of the game. So it's like an extra expression point of the artistic ideals of the game, and not just musically, of course. But I think every expensive hobby is probably teetering on the edge of a generation aging out of it, or not aging into it for whatever reason, cost, bulk, that kind of thing. But I don't know, it feels quite healthy because it's kind of, you know, ultimately it's like adults spending their spare cash with video game vinyl. It's they're saying this game meant a lot to me, and I can't hold it in any other way because it's kind of, you know, on my Game Pass or, you know, in my Steam library. It's just a long list of digital names, and if I go to listen to the soundtrack on Spotify, it's just another, you know, line in a huge long, you know, row of albums or whatever. You can't get hold of it. So
it's tricky though, because I mean you're talking like you collect vinyl.
Funny enough, I don't, but I've spent enough time now talking to the really hardcore collectors, you know, the guys for whom they have, I don't know, 200, 300 titles on their wall and just these giant IKEA Kallax shelves and stuff. And
one thing I am hoping that I can be a part of with our vinyl releases, and this is something that's constantly on my mind, because yes, I'm a vinyl collector myself, and I love to both display, collect, but also play vinyl. What you talk about to me sounds a lot like a pretty typical vinyl collector, more so than just a very general. Like if you talk about Warhammer, I mean, like, you know, I'm baffled at the fact that people will spend hundreds of dollars on a collector's edition of a game. And the thing that comes with the collector's edition are these little tchotchkes, like little figurines or little things that I'm just like, you're never going to use, you're never going to display. They're going to go in your closet, and you're just going to feel good having the collector's edition of a game you really like. And it blows me away because there's so many different ways you can collect, not even just as a gamer, but as anyone who likes to collect anything. And maybe figurines, statues, maybe those are the most common. But when it comes to vinyl, I mean, again, they're not easy to store. If you want to take care of it, you can't have them laying on top of each other, so they have to be upright. So you have to have a specific shelf where they can be upright. If you want to display them, they're not easy to display. You have to buy specific displays to display them. They're big. They're 12 by 12, 11.5 by 11.5. Yeah. They take up a lot of space, both on the wall and in storage. I mean, to me, it's like even if you're not a vinyl collector, but you wish you could be a vinyl collector, I think there's so much going against vinyl that it's really hard to get into just as a general, like, and I know that with gaming, people, maybe it's 50-50, like people that actually play the vinyl and people that just don't even open it and they just keep it as a collector's item. Yeah. If you're more on the realm of it's just a collector's item, it's a piece of merchandise and I want to save it, I think vinyl's a hard sell.
Yeah, but gamers like a challenge. You know, gamers like a challenge. There's a reason people complete From Software games is because, I don't know, gamers face the obstacle of spending of the prospect of spending 200 hours in Persona 5 or whatever, and then they do it anyway. Gamers have to work hard to fall in love with the things they fall in love with. Do you know what really impresses me, actually? The Resident Evil guys, the guys who collect all the merch from Resident Evil. I'm talking like the jackets, the huge cardboard cutouts. They've got these display cases with every kind of Blu-ray version. They import all the different versions of every Resident Evil film and game and everything. Key rings, you name it, berets. And of course, we Lace did the Resident Evil series so far on vinyl. It's just a no-brainer for those guys that into the display cabinets go all these vinyl records with original artwork in most of the case. So I don't know. I mean, those are the the extreme cases. Obviously, there's probably not enough of super collectors to have grown this kind of market, this little market, as big as it has become. But for instance, From Software fans, those are a dedicated bunch. They go deep. That is From Software games, there's a self-selecting bunch of people who torture themselves and then fall deeply, madly in love with these horrible, epic worlds, myself included. So they're pretty hardcore generally as an audience, and I think the more hardcore they are, probably the better chance one has with a vinyl release. And there's I won't say which, but there's other there's circumstances where an indie game that has great community is sold a gazillion more vinyl than a AAA game release. Just orders of magnitude more. So gaming is a strong passion. Whereas I don't know that film soundtrack collectors. We know that anime fans are passionate people, but I don't know. I don't know how film music does on vinyl. Or
I mean, anime is rabid. I mean, you do anything with an anime right now, and it sells like hotcakes. Yeah, it's crazy.
I don't know. It feels quite healthy to me, but then I don't have to deal with the stress of the profit and loss sheet. So, I'm not always on the hook for that kind of thing.
This is where it's tough, right? This is where it gets to the I'm a fan. I'm passionate about this, but at the same time, I have a company that's overseeing those P&Ls.
Exactly.
That's but again, and back to the original, when we first started talking, I think that's potentially an advantage that smaller labels have over someone like Sony, which is they can make these. I think these titles, maybe they only sell, say, 1,000 units. They can make those work.
Yeah, we're owned by Keywords now, so I don't know if we're small or big.
Oh, true. Yeah,
we're kind of a giant multinational and also a kind of team of sort of 5 to 10 in the UK. At the same time, we are Voltron and also Voltron's little finger. Well, look, Colin, it's been absolutely wonderful to talk to you. I'd love to have you back in future. We'll find a slightly different angle and a different topic to get your expertise in. And thanks for sharing.
Yeah, thank you. This has been fun. I always love talking about this. I never get tired of it. So happy to come back.
Thanks everybody for joining me on the GXM podcast as we explore the intersection between video games and music. Please be sure to subscribe, leave us a review on your podcast service of choice, especially Apple. You can find us on X or Twitter, Instagram, Threads and that's at GXM podcast. I'm T Quillfeldt on Twitter, that's TQILLFELDT. Matt is at Mat Ombler on Twitter. If you've got any feedback, hit us up at gxmpodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. The show was produced by both Matt and myself, edited by me, and music is by Zach Foster.